Hungry girl knocks on millionaire's door, unknowingly the one he's been searching for. Emily Thompson felt her stomach ache with hunger as she walked through the relentless rain in Boulder. Her small bare feet were bruised, and her slightly worn clothes clung to her frail 6-year-old body. She had no other options left. That's when her wide, frightened eyes spotted the imposing gate of a mansion at the end of the street. Without a second thought, she pushed the gate, which surprisingly opened with ease, and ran across the well-kept garden to the enormous carved wooden door. Her tiny, trembling hands knocked, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the door opened. "Please, could you spare me a piece of bread?" she asked weakly, looking up at the tall, well-dressed man who stared at her with an unreadable expression. Richard Wilson, a respected real estate tycoon known for his reclusive nature, froze at the sight of the drenched child on his doorstep. It wasn't just her pitiful state that shocked him, it was her familiar features, instantly transporting him to the past. In his hands, he clutched a picture frame containing a photo of a young woman, his sister Catherine, who had disappeared 6 years ago. What's your name?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, unconsciously holding the photo closer to the girl's face to compare their features. "Emily," she answered timidly, puzzled by his reaction. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm so hungry and my grandmother is sick." Richard's heart nearly stopped. Emily, the same name Catherine had chosen for the daughter she never got to meet. And now, as if in a dream or perhaps a miracle, a girl with the same name and the same piercing blue eyes as his sister stood at his door, asking for help. "Come in, please," he said, opening the door wider, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "We'll take care of you." Hesitant, little Emily stepped into the mansion, her eyes wide at the luxury she'd never seen before. Meanwhile, in a modest home on the other side of town, Mrs. Beverly awoke from her fever, only to panic when she realized her granddaughter wasn't there. In the mansion's kitchen, Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked for Richard for over 20 years, prepared a plate of food for the girl while watching suspiciously, as her employer couldn't tear his eyes away from the child. "You can't just take in every stray child who knocks on our door," Margaret whispered to Richard while Emily was distracted, eating hungrily. "Remember what happened last time you thought you'd found your niece? This time is different." "Margaret," he replied, never looking away from the girl. "Look at her, she's the spitting image of Catherine when she was little, and the name, it can't be a coincidence." Unaware of their conversation, Emily devoured the hot soup and fresh bread as if it were the best meal in the world. Between bites, she glanced sideways at the mysterious man watching her so intently. "Where do you live, Emily?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. "With my grandmother Beverly in the Pinecrest neighborhood," she answered after swallowing a piece of bread. "She's very sick. I need to go back soon." A chill ran down Richard's spine. Beverly was the name of his sister's mother-in-law, the mother of Daniel, his former brother-in-law. Could there really be so many coincidences? Or had he, after 6 years of relentless searching, finally found the niece he'd never met? "I'll take you home as soon as the rain stops," he said, struggling to contain his emotions. "But first, could you tell me more about your family?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The little girl hesitated, remembering her grandmother's constant warnings not to talk about her life with strangers, but there was something familiar about that man, as if she'd met him somewhere before. Emily had felt this way ever since she saw him open the door. It was strange. How could she know such a wealthy man who lived in such a big house? Her entire life had been spent in a small apartment with Grandma Beverly on the streets of Pinecrest, neighborhood where everyone knew each other, at the public school she'd attended for 2 years. She'd never been to a place like this before, yet there was something about his eyes, the same shade of blue she saw every morning in the bathroom mirror while Grandma Beverly combed her unruly hair. The same blue her grandmother said was, "Just like your mother's, my angel." She'd never seen many pictures of her mother. Grandma kept a few in an old box, which she only opened on special occasions, like Emily's birthday or the day Grandma called the day your mother went to heaven. On those days, Beverly would take the photos out with reverent care, as if they were fragile relics that might crumble at the touch. "Your mother was beautiful," Grandma always said, her eyes brimming, "and you have her eyes, the same deep blue, like the sky after rain." Maybe that was why she felt this strange connection to the elegant man in front of her. The same eyes, the same color. A coincidence, probably. But for a 6-year-old girl with so few ties to her past, even coincidences felt meaningful. "I live just with my Grandma Beverly. My mother went to heaven when I was born," she said, lowering her gaze. "I never knew my father. Grandma says he's gone too." Richard swallowed hard, holding back the tears threatening to fall. Catherine, his only sister, had mysteriously disappeared right after announcing she was pregnant. The child's father, Daniel, a musician Richard had never approved of, vanished around the same time. For years, he'd used all his wealth and influence to find them, believing Daniel had convinced Catherine to run away because of Richard's constant interference in their lives. Not far away, Mrs. Beverly, despite her high fever, wandered the streets in growing desperation. The heavy rain had stopped, but her heart was stormy. Where was her granddaughter? The only treasure she had left after her daughter Catherine didn't survive childbirth, and her son-in-law Daniel ended up leaving, unable to cope with the loss or the responsibility of raising a daughter alone. Beverly paused for a moment, leaning against a lamppost to catch her breath. At 67, her body no longer responded with the same vitality as before, especially now, weakened by pneumonia. But desperation was fuel enough to keep her moving. "Emily!" she called, her hoarse voice barely carrying down the wet street. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a bakery looked at her with concern. "Mrs. Beverly, shouldn't you be in bed? You look pale." It was Mr. Jenkins, owner of the bakery where she bought bread on credit during the toughest months. "My granddaughter Jenkins," she answered, trembling. "Emily went out alone. I can't find her anywhere." "The little one with the blue eyes? But she's so young to be out by herself." "I fell asleep with the fever," Beverly explained, guilt weighing on every word. "When I woke up, she was gone." The baker set aside his broom and stepped closer, offering support. "We'll find her, Mrs. Beverly. I'll close the shop and help you look. You shouldn't be walking around in this state." Beverly accepted her friend's help, but her mind remained in torment. This wasn't the first time she'd faced the fear of losing everything. 6 years ago, when she held her daughter Catherine for the last time at the hospital, she felt the world collapse. And then, when Daniel left, leaving only a letter and some crumpled bills on the table, she thought she wouldn't survive the pain. But she did. For Emily, she turned pain into strength. She went back to working as a seamstress, even as arthritis made every stitch harder. She saved every penny to give her granddaughter a decent life. She smiled when she wanted to cry, sang when she wanted to scream, kept going when she wanted to give up. And now, the mere thought of losing Emily felt like facing the end of the world all over again. "Where would a hungry child go?" asked Mr. Jenkins, trying to reason logically. The answer came like a slap. "The rich neighborhood," whispered Mrs. Beverly, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with her fever. "She heard me say I'd ask for help at the big houses when I got better." A new fear gripped her heart. The rich neighborhood, where people like Richard Wilson, Catherine's brother, lived. The man who had sworn to take Emily from her if he ever got the chance. "You remind me of someone," Emily suddenly said, staring at Richard. "Grandma has a hidden photo of a man who looks like you." Richard's heart raced even faster. "Does she?" he asked, trying to stay composed. "And does your grandmother talk about this man?" "Only when she thinks I'm not listening," Emily replied with childlike innocence. "She says he's a bad man who wanted to keep my mom away from my dad, but you don't seem bad." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Was that how Mrs. Beverly described him to the girl? As a villain. For years he'd blamed himself. For being so harsh with Catherine and Daniel. For trying to control his sister's life. Thinking he knew what was best for her. After they disappeared, he realized his overbearing ways had only pushed away the people he loved most. The rain finally stopped, and Richard decided he needed to take Emily home to confront the past that had haunted him for years. He asked Margaret to find some dry clothes for the girl, probably left behind by one of the staff's nieces, who occasionally visited the mansion. "Come on, I'll take you home," he said, once Emily was dressed in clean, dry clothes, still too big for her small frame. "Oh, your grandmother must be worried." In the luxurious car, Emily stared out the window wide-eyed. She'd never ridden in something so beautiful and comfortable. Richard watched her in the rearview mirror, noting every expression, every gesture, that reminded him of his sister. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. This was his niece, the daughter Catherine never got to raise. The beige leather interior of the Lexus felt like another world to Emily. Her tiny fingers timidly traced the polished wood panels on the armrest, while her eyes wandered over the buttons and lights on the dashboard. "It's like being inside." "A spaceship," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard. He smiled, remembering how easily Catherine had been impressed by new things too. When he bought his first luxury car after closing a particularly profitable deal, he took his sister for a ride. Even as an adult, Catherine had shown the same childlike wonder he now saw in Emily. "Cars were different when your mum was little," he remarked, trying to connect. "We grew up taking the bus everywhere." Emily turned to him, curious. "Were you poor too?" The question, so direct, so innocent, hit Richard like a gut punch. The way she said "poor too," as if it were just a fact of life, as natural as saying, "We're American too," or "We live in Boulder too." "Yes," he answered, swallowing hard. "We were very poor. Our father worked in construction, and our mother was a housekeeper. We lived in a very small house, smaller than the apartment you live in with your grandmother." "So how did you get rich?" she asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. It was a question Richard usually answered with a well-rehearsed story about hard work, determination, and business vision, the version he told in interviews and speeches to young entrepreneurs. But looking into those blue eyes so much like Catherine's, he felt he owed the truth. "I got lucky," he admitted. "I started as an office boy at a real estate agency when I was 16. The owner, Mr. Johnson, had no children and liked my interest in the business. He taught me everything, paid for my business degree, and when he retired, he sold me the company for a price I could pay over the years." He paused, recalling details he rarely shared. "Your mother always said I had a guardian, angel named Johnson," he continued with a nostalgic smile. "She said I should do for others what Mr. Johnson did for me, but I was too busy getting rich to listen." "And now you listen?" Emily asked with that disarming wisdom that sometimes emerged from her innocence. Richard thought for a moment, gazing out the window at the streets of Boulder, where historic mansions stood alongside modest homes. "I'm starting to listen," he finally replied. "A little late maybe, but I'm starting." "Do you like music, Emily?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Yes," she replied excitedly. "Grandma taught me a song my mum used to sing. Want to hear?" Before he could answer, Emily began singing a melody Richard recognized instantly. It was the lullaby his mother sang to him and Catherine when they were children, the same one Catherine had promised to sing to her own kids one day. Emotion overwhelmed him, and silent tears rolled down his face. Emily's childish voice filled the car with a simple, almost primal tune, yet one deeply rooted in Richard's most intimate memories. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The song, so American and so specific to his childhood, instantly transported Richard back to the tiny room he shared with Catherine in the humble home where they grew up. He could see his mother, Mrs. Miller, sitting on the edge of the bed, singing softly as she ran her calloused hands through their hair. His father came home late from work, smelling of cement and sweat, but always found the energy to join in on the last verse. It was before the fights, before his father's drinking problems, before his mother's illness that drained the family's savings, before Richard vowed he'd never be poor again, never feel powerless against circumstance. He glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. She sang with her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the rhythm just like Catherine used to. For a moment, time seemed to fold, past and present coexisting in the confined space of the car. When Emily finished, she opened her eyes and met Richard's gaze in the mirror. He quickly wiped his face, trying to hide the tears, but she'd already noticed. "Are you crying, Uncle?" she asked with genuine concern. No, no, he lied, forcing a smile. It's just allergies. Grandma cries too when I sing that song, Emily remarked casually. She says they're happy tears because the song makes her remember Mommy. Are they happy tears too, Uncle? Richard hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Emily. They're happy tears. My mother, your grandmother, whom you never met, used to sing this same song to me and your mother when we were children. So it's a family song, she exclaimed with a radiant smile that lit up her entire face. Grandma Beverly says families have special things that get passed down from one person to another, like recipes and stories. And now we have our family song. Our family song. The words echoed in Richard's mind. How had this little child, in less than a day, managed to tear down the walls he had spent years building around the concept of family? How, with such simplicity, had she included him in an us he thought he had lost forever? Following Emily's directions, they arrived at a small two-room house on the outskirts of Boulder. The contrast with Richard's mansion couldn't have been greater. The house, though clean and tidy, showed clear signs of poverty and hardship. The moment the car stopped, the front door opened, and an elderly woman with graying hair and a weary expression appeared, her eyes red from crying. "Emily!" Mrs. Beverly shouted, rushing toward the girl who had just stepped out of the car. "Oh my God, where have you been? I've been worried sick." The girl ran into her grandmother's arms, but before she could explain anything, Mrs. Beverly looked up and saw the man stepping out of the car. Her face went pale. "Richard," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "Hello, Beverly," he replied, keeping a respectful distance. "I found Emily knocking on my door, asking for food." Beverly clutched her granddaughter tightly, as if trying to protect her. "Emily, go inside now," she ordered, without taking her eyes off Richard. "But Grandma, he was really kind to me. He gave me food and dry clothes and—" "Now, Emily!" Beverly's tone left no room for argument. Confused and sad, the girl obeyed, stepping inside but lingering near the door to listen to the adults' conversation. "What do you want after all these years?" Beverly asked, her voice trembling with anger. "Wasn't it enough to destroy my daughter and son-in-law's lives?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Beverly. I didn't even know you were in Boulder. I spent years looking for Catherine and Daniel, and now I find out my sister is gone and I have a niece I never knew." "Catherine didn't survive childbirth," Beverly said, her voice breaking. "The doctors did what they could, but she was too weak, too heartbroken after everything that happened between you." The words struck Richard like arrows. And Daniel. He couldn't bear it. After Catherine passed, he stayed for a few months, but the guilt and grief were too much. One day he went out to buy diapers and never came back. He left only a letter asking for forgiveness, saying I would take better care of Emily than he ever could. Richard ran his hands over his face, devastated by the revelations. "Why didn't you ever reach out to me? She's my niece, my blood too." "Reach out to you?" Beverly's outrage was clear. "After how you treated my son, after all your threats to use your money and influence to take Catherine away from him, did you really think I'd hand my granddaughter over to the man who contributed to her parents' misery?" Inside the house, Emily listened to every word, not fully understanding but sensing something important was happening. "I've changed, Beverly," Richard said, sincerity in his voice. "Losing Catherine changed me. I've spent the last years regretting every harsh word, every interference. I just wanted to find her and apologize, to tell her she was right and I was wrong, that Daniel was a good man, just not what I had imagined for her." Beverly studied her former brother-in-law, noting the marks that time and suffering had left on his once arrogant face. There was sincerity in his eyes, a sincerity she had never seen before. "And now, what do you intend to do?" she asked, still wary. "I want to meet my niece. I want to be part of her life. I want to help you if you'll let me." Mrs. Beverly laughed without humor. "Now you want to help. Where was that help when we needed it? When Catherine was in the hospital, when Daniel couldn't get a job because your influence closed every door?" Richard lowered his head, accepting each accusation like a deserved blow. "I can't change the past, Beverly, but I can try to do something for the future. Emily deserves more than this life of hardship. Catherine would have wanted her daughter to have opportunities, education, comfort. Emily has the most Important thing, love. Something you might not be able to buy with all your money, Richard. The conversation was interrupted by a violent coughing fit from Mrs. Beverley. Richard noticed how pale she was, how her hands trembled slightly. "You're not well," he observed. "You need a doctor." "I don't need your charity," she replied proudly, but another coughing spell cut her off. Just then, Emily ran out of the house. "Grandma, you're getting worse," the girl cried, hugging her grandmother. "Please, sir, help my grandma. She's been sick for days and won't go to the doctor because she says it's expensive." Richard looked at the desperate girl and the grandmother, too proud to accept help, even when she clearly needed it. He made a decision. "Beverly, don't do this for me. Do it for Emily. Let me call a doctor for you." Something in Emily's eyes, so much like Catherine's, seemed to break through Mrs. Beverley's last barrier of resistance. She nodded slightly, allowing Richard to help her inside and sit down. With a few phone calls, Richard arranged for one of Boulder's best doctors to come to Mrs. Beverley's house immediately. The diagnosis was pneumonia in an advanced stage requiring immediate hospitalization. "I can't go to the hospital," Mrs. Beverley protested weakly. "Who will take care of Emily?" "I can stay with her while you recover," Richard offered, surprising himself with how quickly the words came. "If you'll allow it, of course." Mrs. Beverley looked at her former brother-in-law with suspicion, then at her granddaughter, who seemed to have developed an inexplicable bond with this stranger who was, in fact, her uncle. "Absolutely not. I won't leave my granddaughter with you." "Grandma, please," Emily begged. "Uncle Richard is nice. He gave me food when I was hungry, and I like him. He has eyes like mine." Mrs. Beverley looked at her granddaughter in surprise. "Uncle Richard? How did she know? Had she overheard more of their conversation than they realized? "There's my neighbor, Mrs. Wilson," Mrs. Beverley suggested, still reluctant. "She can take care of Emily." "Mrs. Wilson is traveling, Grandma. She went to visit her daughter in Annapolis, remember?" Emily corrected. Cornered by the situation and weakened by illness, Mrs. Beverley finally gave in, but not before making Richard promise under all conditions that he wouldn't try to take Emily from her, wouldn't leave town with the girl, and would bring her for daily visits to the hospital. "I promise, Beverly. I won't do anything to separate you two. I just want to help and get to know my niece." On the way to the hospital, sitting in the back seat of the car with Emily beside her, Mrs. Beverley watched the interaction between uncle and niece. There was a natural connection there, something she couldn't deny. The girl asked questions and the businessman answered with patience and kindness, a side of him Mrs. Beverley had never seen before. After settling Mrs. Beverley in the hospital and ensuring she'd receive the best care, Richard took Emily back to the mansion. The girl was tired, but still amazed by everything she saw. "This place is so big," she exclaimed, as Richard led her down the main hallway. "Do you live here all alone, Uncle?" "Yes," he replied with a sad smile. "Just me and a few staff members. It's a very big house for one person, isn't it?" I had never seen such a beautiful house. It looks like a princess's castle. Emily's innocence and wonder brought a warmth Richard hadn't felt in a long time. For years he had buried himself in work, accumulating more and more wealth, as if that could fill the void left by the loss of his sister. Now, he walked the halls of his mansion with new eyes, seeing it through the awestruck gaze of a child. Margaret prepared a room for Emily, as close to Richard's as possible at his request. While making the bed, the housekeeper noticed how her employer seemed to have regained 10 years of youth in just a few hours. There was a sparkle in his eyes she hadn't seen since before Catherine's disappearance. "Tomorrow morning we'll visit your grandmother," Richard said after tucking Emily in. "And then, if you'd like, we can stop by your house to pick up some of your things." "Uncle Richard," Emily called as he reached the door, "did you know my mum?" The question caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "Yes, Emily. Your mother was my sister. We were very close when we were younger. Grandma only has a few pictures of her. Do you have more? I want to see what she looked like." "I have several," he answered, emotion tightening his throat. "I'll show them to you tomorrow." "And was she happy?" the girl asked with a seriousness beyond her years. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, thoughtful. Your mother was the most joyful, full-of-life person I've ever known. She loved music, danced all around the house, and had the most beautiful smile in the world. A smile just like yours." Emily smiled, satisfied with the answer. Her eyes were already heavy with sleep. "Good night, Uncle Richard." "Good night, Emily. Sleep well." As he closed the bedroom door, Richard felt a mix of emotions. He couldn't name pain, joy, hope, fear all at once. In just a few hours, his life had been turned upside down by the appearance of that hungry little girl at his doorstep. He walked to his study and unlocked the drawer of his desk. From it, he pulled out a carved wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were all the memories of Catherine he had kept, photos, letters, little gifts they had exchanged over the years. With trembling hands, he spread the photographs across the table, studying his sister's smiling face at different stages of her life. In one of the more recent photos, Catherine was embracing Daniel, both smiling in front of a beach. Richard remembered how he had criticized that relationship from the start. Daniel was a musician, living gig to gig with no financial stability or ambitions. Richard deemed worthy for someone involved with his sister. He had wanted Catherine to marry someone on her level, someone from their social circle, someone who could offer her the lifestyle he thought appropriate. How foolish I was, he thought, running his fingers over the image of the happy couple. Catherine had never cared about money or status. She valued authenticity, kindness, passion, things Daniel had in abundance, but that Richard, blinded by prejudice and pride, had failed to see. When Catherine announced she was pregnant, the rift between the siblings had already grown unbearable. Fearing his sister and future niece or nephew would struggle, Richard offered financial help, but with conditions. Catherine would have to move near him and allow him to guide the couple on managing money and raising the child. What he saw as protection, Catherine took as yet another attempt to control her. Their last argument had been terrible. Harsh words were exchanged, threats were made. Richard, in the heat of anger, even said he would use his influence and money to secure custody of the child if he thought she wasn't being properly cared for. That was the last straw. The next morning, when he went to Catherine's house to apologize, he discovered that she and Daniel had left during the night, leaving no address or contact. For 6 years, he had used every available resource to find them. He hired private detectives, offered rewards, searched every corner of the country. Ironically, they were just a few hours away in Boulder, living under Mrs. Beverley's care, while he looked for them in the most distant places. A noise at the office door interrupted his thoughts. It was Margaret with a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing the cup on the table. "It's been a night of many emotions." "Thank you, Margaret." The housekeeper glanced at the scattered photographs and sighed. "She looks so much like Mrs. Catherine, doesn't she? The same eyes, the same smile." "Yes," Richard agreed, taking a sip of tea. "And the same stubbornness, apparently. Imagine leaving the house alone to ask for food at just 6 years old." "She has the determination of the Wilsons," Margaret remarked with a small smile. "All of you are like that, stubborn, once you've made up your mind." Richard smiled back. Margaret had practically raised him and Catherine after their parents died in an accident when they were still teenagers. She knew the Wilson siblings better than anyone. "What should I do now, Margaret?" he asked, revealing rare vulnerability. "How can I fix so many mistakes?" "One day at a time, Mr. Richard. One day at a time. That little girl needs you, and Mrs. Beverley, though she won't admit it, does too. You have a chance to do things differently this time." Richard nodded. Grateful for the advice, he wouldn't make the same mistakes again. This time he would be patient, respect boundaries, offer help without trying to control. He would be the uncle Emily deserved, and perhaps in time earn Beverley's forgiveness as well. The next morning, Emily woke up disoriented, not recognizing where she was. For a moment, panic set in until she remembered the events of the previous day, the hunger, the rain, the mansion, the man who was her uncle, her grandmother in the hospital. "Good morning, little one," said Margaret, entering the room with a tray. "I brought your breakfast. Mr. Richard asked me to let you know he's finishing an important call and will come to take you to see your grandmother soon." Emily stared in wonder at the tray. There was fresh bread, cake, fruit, juice, chocolate milk, more food than she usually saw in days. Her stomach growled in anticipation. "Can I really eat all this?" she asked, incredulous. Margaret felt a pang in her heart. How could a child be so surprised by an ordinary breakfast? "Of course you can, dear, and if you want more, just ask." As Emily ate, Margaret set aside some clothes she had borrowed from the daughter of one of the cooks, who had a girl slightly older than Emily. "Let's give you a bath and put on these clean clothes before we go to the hospital. All right?" the housekeeper suggested kindly. Emily looked at the new clothes with an expression torn between fascination and uncertainty. They were simple items, a pink cotton blouse, a pair of jeans, and some sneakers. But to her they seemed luxurious, without the patches and wear she was used to. "Are these really for me?" she asked hesitantly. Margaret's heart ached. How often has this child had to wear second-hand clothes, patched until they couldn't be any more, she thought. "Yes, dear. They're all for you," she replied, gently. "Shall we go to the bathroom for a nice warm bath?" In the spacious bathroom of the guest suite, Emily marveled at the bathtub. At home, showers were quick to save water. The bathtub, with its jets and the perfumed bubbles Margaret had added, seemed like a dream come true. "Can I really get all the way in?" she asked, incredulous. "Of course you can. That's what it's for," replied Margaret, helping her undress. The housekeeper suppressed a look of shock when she saw the girl's thin body. It wasn't severe malnutrition, but it clearly showed signs of insufficient nourishment. Her ribs were visible under her pale skin, and her little arms looked as fragile as thin twigs. With motherly gentleness, Margaret washed Emily's hair, patiently untangling the brown curls. As she worked, she chatted with the girl, who opened up more and more, talking about school, the neighbors, and the stories her grandmother read to her before bed. "You know, Margaret, I never knew my father or my mother," Emily confessed at one point, playing with the bath bubbles. "I only have Grandma, but now I've met Uncle Richard, who's my mother's brother. That means I have more. Family, right?" Margaret, who had worked for Richard long before the fallout with Catherine, felt her eyes well up. "Yes, sweetheart, you have more family than you think." After the bath and dressed in new clothes, Emily looked like a different child. Her brown curls, now clean and combed, framed her delicate face, making her resemblance to the mother she'd never known even more striking. Margaret took her to the kitchen, where Richard was waiting, finishing a business call. When he turned and saw the transformed Emily, his face took on an astonished expression he couldn't hide. "Catherine," he whispered involuntarily. The resemblance, already noticeable before, now seemed almost supernatural. The same vivid blue eyes, the same face shape, the same brown curls that resisted any attempt to be tamed. Even the way she tilted her head slightly, confused by his reaction, was identical to Catherine's characteristic gesture. "No, Uncle." "It's me, Emily," she corrected, not understanding. Richard quickly composed himself, forcing a smile. "Of course, Em. It's just that you look so much like your mother. You're beautiful." When Richard saw her coming down the stairs, accompanied by Margaret, his heart clenched. It was like seeing Catherine as a child again. "You look beautiful, Emily," he said, smiling. "Ready to visit your grandmother?" The girl nodded eagerly. On the way to the hospital, she bombarded her uncle with questions about her mother, the mansion, his business, anything her curious mind could think of. Richard answered patiently, charmed by his niece's intelligence and liveliness. At the hospital, they found Mrs. Beverly awake but still visibly weak. Her eyes lit up when she saw her granddaughter, but hardened again when they landed on Richard. "Grandma!" Emily exclaimed, running to hug her. "Are you feeling better?" "I am, my love," Mrs. Beverly replied, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "Are you okay? How was your night at your uncle's house?" "It was amazing, Grandma. His house is huge with so many rooms, and Margaret, who works there, is really nice. And guess what? Uncle Richard has lots of pictures of Mom. He promised to show them to me." Mrs. Beverly shot a questioning look at Richard, who remained at a respectful distance. "She asked about Catherine last night," he explained. "She said you don't have many photos, and I offered to show the ones I've kept." Mrs. Beverly nodded slightly, acknowledging her granddaughter's right to know more about her mother. "The doctor said you'll need to stay a few more days." "Mrs. Beverly," Richard said cautiously, The pneumonia is under control, but they want to ensure a full recovery. I can't stay here for days, she protested. Who's going to take care of Emily? Who's going to pay for all this? So I already said Emily can stay with me until you recover. And don't worry about the expenses. Consider this a small repayment for all the years you took care of my niece alone. Mrs. Beverly seemed about to protest again, but one look, had Emily, so excited and comfortable with the uncle she'd just met, made her reconsider. Maybe it was time to leave the past behind for her granddaughter's sake. All right, she finally agreed, but with a few conditions. You bring Emily to see me every day. Don't take her far from Boulder, and respect the way I've raised her so far. You have my word, Mrs. Beverly, Richard promised solemnly. In the days that followed, a routine took shape. In the morning, Richard would take Emily to school, insisting on paying the overdue tuition and making sure she didn't fall behind. In the afternoon, they'd visit Mrs. Beverly at the hospital, always bringing small gifts or treats to cheer up the recovering woman. In the evening, they'd return to the mansion, where Emily slowly began making her mark on every corner, every painting, every object. One night, as Margaret was getting Emily ready for bed, Richard went to his study and pulled out a special photo album. It was one Catherine had put together during her teenage years, filled with pictures of the two siblings, their parents, and happy family moments. He carried it to Emily's room, where he found her already in her pajamas, sitting on the bed. I brought something to show you, he said, sitting beside his niece. It's an album your mother made when she was young. Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement as he opened it, revealing the first photographs. Catherine at 15 with her radiant smile. Richard at 18, serious and formal even then. Their parents, simple and hard-working people who had given everything for their children. Is that my mum? Emily asked, pointing to a photo where Catherine, around 17, was playing guitar in a park. Yes, Richard confirmed, smiling at the memory. Your mother loved music. She played guitar beautifully and had a lovely voice. Your father was a musician too, you know, that's how they met, at a performance. My dad? Emily's eyes widened. Mrs. Beverly rarely spoke about Daniel, and when she did, it was always vaguely and sadly. Yes, Daniel. He played in bars and restaurants. He was very talented, Richard admitted, surprising himself with the sincerity of the praise. With time and distance, he could finally see his former brother-in-law's qualities, not just his flaws. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Turning the pages of the album, Richard shared stories about each photograph, about his and Catherine's childhood and youth, about how their parents had started with very little and worked hard to give their children a good life. Emily listened, fascinated, discovering a part of her history she'd never known existed. And this picture? She asked, pointing to one where Catherine, now grown up, hugged a young, smiling man in front of a makeshift stage. Richard hesitated for a moment. That's your father, Daniel, he finally answered. It was the first time I met him, at an independent music festival where he was performing. Your mother dragged me there, saying I had to meet the most amazing man in the world. He was handsome, Emily remarked, admiring the image of the father she'd never known, and he looks happy with Mom. They were very happy together, Richard acknowledged, his throat tightening. It just took me too long to see that. In the days that followed, the photo album became part of their nightly routine. Every night before bed, Emily would ask to see more photos, to hear more stories about her parents. And every night, Richard found himself revealing more about himself, his mistakes, his accomplishments, his humanity. At the hospital, Mrs. Beverly was gradually improving. With each visit, she noticed changes in Emily. New clothes, a different hairstyle, words and expressions she certainly hadn't learned at home. But most of all, she noticed a joy, a liveliness in her granddaughter that seemed to have awakened with her uncle's presence in her life. One afternoon, while Emily was distracted chatting with a nurse who had grown fond of her, Mrs. Beverly decided to have a frank talk with Richard. You've changed, she observed bluntly. I hope for the better, he replied with a slight smile. Emily really likes you, Mrs. Beverly continued. She's never had a male figure in her life. Daniel left when she was just 3 months old. I'm sorry to hear that. Daniel must have suffered terribly after losing Catherine. Mrs. Beverly nodded thoughtfully. He did. He loved her too much. When she was gone, it was like a part of him went with her. He tried, Richard. I swear he tried to be a good father to Emily, but the pain was too great. Every time he looked at her, he saw Catherine in her eyes, in her smile. Richard understood that feeling perfectly. He himself felt something similar when he looked at Emily, though in his case the resemblance to Catherine brought more comfort than pain. "Where is he now?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I'm not entirely sure. I get postcards occasionally from different places. He travels with a band, from what I gather. He always asks about Emily, sends money when he can, but he's never come back to see her. I think the guilt and pain are still too much." Richard absorbed the information in silence. So many lives shaped by love, loss, pride, regret. So many wasted years that could never be recovered. "When are you being discharged?" he asked, changing the subject. "Tomorrow, if all goes well," Mrs. Beverly replied, sounding relieved. "I can't wait to go home with Emily." A shadow of sadness crossed Richard's face. He had quickly grown used to his niece's presence in his home, her laughter, echoing through the once empty halls, her endless questions, the vibrant energy she brought. "Mrs. Beverly," he began cautiously, "I'd like to stay in Emily's life if you'll allow it. I don't want to replace anyone or interfere with how you raise her. I just want to be her uncle, to get to know her better, maybe help in some way." Mrs. Beverly studied her former brother-in-law for a long moment, as if trying to see past the surface to the heart of his intentions. "She'll need to go back to school on Monday," she said finally. "I'll still be too weak to take her. Maybe you could keep picking her up and dropping her off for a few weeks until I've fully recovered." It was a small concession, but to Richard it meant the world. It was a door left slightly ajar to the future, a chance to be part of his niece's life. "I'd love to," he replied sincerely. "And if you need anything else, just ask." When Mrs. Beverly was discharged the next day, Richard insisted on driving her home in his car, with Emily excitedly sitting between them. The little girl chattered non-stop about all the things she'd discovered at the mansion, how Margaret had taught her to make cookies, the photos of her mother she'd seen, the huge bedroom where she'd slept. When they arrived at the modest apartment, Mrs. Beverly was shocked by what she found. The place was clean and tidy, fresh food was in the fridge, flowers in a vase on the table, and even some repairs she'd been putting off for lack of money had been taken care of. "I hope you don't mind," Richard said, noticing her surprise. "I asked some staff to have everything ready for your return. Emily told me about the bathroom leak and the broken window, so I took the liberty of arranging the repairs." Mrs. Beverly didn't know whether to feel grateful or annoyed by the intrusion. On one hand, it was a relief to find the house in order. On the other, she felt uncomfortable accepting favors from Richard after years of cultivating her independence. "Grandma, look!" Emily exclaimed, running to her small room. "There are new sheets on my bed, and look, a teddy bear." The genuine joy in her granddaughter's voice softened Mrs. Beverly's reservations a little. What harm was there in letting Emily enjoy a few small luxuries? Childhood passed too quickly. "Thank you," she said quietly to Richard, "for the help, for looking after her, for everything." "Don't mention it," he replied. "We're family, after all." That night, after Richard left, promising to return on Monday to take Emily to school, grandmother and granddaughter sat together in the small living room, just as they had every night before Mrs. Beverly's hospitalization. But something had changed. Emily, usually content with her simple life, now spoke excitedly about the mansion, about her uncle, about the stories she'd heard. "Grandma, why did you never tell me about Uncle Richard before?" she asked suddenly, with the innocence only a child could have. Mrs. Beverly sighed, searching for words a 6-year-old could understand. "It's complicated, sweetheart. When grown-ups get hurt, sometimes it's hard to forgive and move on. But Uncle Richard seems sorry. He cries when he looks at Mommy's pictures, you know. I saw him one night when he thought I was asleep." The revelation surprised Mrs. Beverly. The Richard she'd known years ago would never have shown such vulnerability. Maybe he really had changed. "People can change, right, Grandma?" Emily continued, as if reading her grandmother's thoughts. "My teacher says everyone deserves a second chance when they're truly sorry." Mrs. Beverly smiled, amazed at her little one's wisdom. "Out of the mouths of babes," she thought. "Yes, my love, people can change. And maybe your uncle." Richard does deserve that second chance. In the days that followed, a new routine took shape. Richard would pick Emily up in the morning to take her to school and bring her back in the afternoon. On weekends, he'd show up with invitations. A trip to the park, a movie, a visit to the zoo. He always asked Mrs. Beverley's permission first, always respected her boundaries and schedule. Gradually, the walls between them began to crumble. Mrs. Beverley started accepting occasional gifts for Emily: books, clothes, educational toys. She still refused any direct financial help for herself, but she saw no harm in letting her granddaughter have opportunities she couldn't provide alone. About 3 months after their first reunion, Richard arrived with a different proposal. "Beverly, I'd like to help with Emily's education," he said, nervous as a teenager. "The school she's in is good, but it has limited resources. There's a private school nearby with an excellent reputation, a science lab, music and language classes." "I can't afford a private school, Richard," Mrs. Beverley interrupted sharply. He noticed how her shoulders stiffened immediately, how her hands tightened around the dish towel she was holding. Her pride, he'd come to realize, was like armor carefully built over years of hardship, a necessary shield for a woman who had raised first a daughter and then a granddaughter on her own. Richard also noticed that the frequent visits to the mansion were having an effect on Emily. The girl had started asking questions Mrs. Beverley found hard to answer. Why couldn't they have a bigger house? Why wasn't there always dessert after dinner? Why didn't she have a room just for herself like at her uncle's house? They weren't spiteful or ungrateful questions. Emily was naturally a sweet and thankful child. They were just innocent observations about the differences between the two worlds she now lived in. But he knew each question was like a tiny needle in Mrs. Beverley's heart, reminding her of the limitations she faced raising her granddaughter. "Yesterday I visited her school," Richard said, shifting his approach slightly. "I spoke with the principal, Miss Peterson. She's a dedicated educator, working miracles with minimal resources." Mrs. Beverley looked surprised. "You went to the public school?" she asked, incredulous. Richard nodded. "I wanted to understand Emily's learning environment better. The principal showed me everything. The classrooms are clean and organized, but overcrowded. The library has few books, many outdated. The sports court needs urgent repairs, and there's no music or arts program." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Peterson mentioned Emily is one of the brightest students she's ever had. Said she learns at an impressive pace, especially in math and science, but she worries the school won't challenge her enough in the coming years." Mrs. Beverley sighed, looking away. She already knew. She'd noticed how Emily finished homework in minutes, devoured the few books they borrowed from the public library, and asked questions she couldn't always answer. "Emily's talent is a gift, Beverly," Richard continued softly. "A gift. Catherine and Daniel gave her. Don't let my past mistakes keep her from reaching her full potential. I know I'd pay. Think of it as a kind of fund for her education. Something Catherine would have wanted for her daughter." Mrs. Beverley hesitated. On one hand, she'd always dreamed of giving her granddaughter the best education possible. On the other, she feared becoming dependent on Richard, or worse, that he might use this to control Emily's life later. "What if I say no?" she tested. "Then I respect your decision," he replied promptly. "Emily will stay at her current school, and I'll keep picking her up as I have been." "It's not a condition, Beverly, just an offer." Something in his sincerity convinced her. "I'll think about it," she said, surprising both Richard and herself. As Mrs. Beverley considered the school proposal, another unexpected matter arose. One Sunday afternoon, while Emily played in the mansion's garden during a visit, the doorbell rang. Margaret answered and returned with a worried expression. "Mr. Wilson, there's a man asking for Emily," she said quietly. "He says he's—" "Daniel Costa." Richard's blood ran cold. Daniel, after all these years. Mrs. Beverley had mentioned he sent postcards occasionally, but he never imagined he'd show up unannounced. "Where is he?" asked, standing. "At the entrance. I didn't invite him in because I wasn't sure." "You did right, Margaret. Please stay with Emily in the garden. Don't say anything to her yet." With his heart racing, Richard walked to the front door. Standing on the porch was a tired-looking man with scruffy stubble and simple but clean clothes. Despite the years, Richard recognized him immediately. Daniel, his sister's former boyfriend, Emily's father. "Daniel," he greeted, automatically extending his hand. "Richard," the other replied, shaking it with visible surprise. "Didn't expect to be greeted by you. Mrs. Beverly told me Emily would be here today." "You spoke to Mrs. Beverly?" Richard asked, confused. "I called her yesterday. I've been in town a week, working up the courage to see them. Finally, I called and Mrs. Beverly told me Emily would be here today for lunch." Richard processed the information slowly. Mrs. Beverly knew Daniel was coming and hadn't told him. Why? To test his reaction? To protect Emily from a possible conflict? "Come in, please," he invited, deciding to tackle one problem at a time. "Emily is in the garden, playing. She doesn't know you were coming." Daniel seemed nervous, almost panicked. "I don't know if this was a good idea. She doesn't even know me. She must hate me for leaving." "She's 6, Daniel, and she talks about you with curiosity, not anger." Mrs. Beverly never spoke. "Badly of you to her." Daniel looked genuinely surprised and relieved by this. "Mrs. Beverly has always been an extraordinary woman," he remarked with a sigh. "A better mother than I could ever be a father." The two men walked silently toward the garden, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. Along the way, Richard glanced sideways at Daniel, noticing how the years had been hard on him. The handsome, confident young man from the photos had been replaced by one prematurely aged, his eyes revealing some kind of constant pain. In the garden, Emily was happily playing with a toy gardening set Richard had given her, planting colorful plastic flowers in a bed specially designated for her. Margaret supervised closely, casting worried looks at the approaching men. "Emily," Richard called softly, "there's someone here who'd really like to meet you." The little girl looked up, curious. Her blue eyes, so much like Catherine's, first settled on Richard, then on the stranger beside him. For a moment she seemed confused, as if trying to connect that face to some distant memory. "Hi, Emily," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm your dad." The girl's eyes widened, dropping the little toy shovel she'd been holding. She looked at Richard as if seeking confirmation, and he nodded slightly. "Daddy," she whispered, disbelieving. "The daddy Grandma says is traveling." Daniel swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Yes, sweetheart, I've been traveling a lot, but I never forgot about you. Never." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly Emily stood and walked to Daniel, studying his face intently. "You look like the picture Uncle Richard showed me," she finally declared. "But in that picture you smiled more." A shaky smile appeared on Daniel's face. "Back then I had more reasons to smile. Your mother was alive and we were so happy waiting for you to be born." Daniel felt a lump in his throat remembering that time. Catherine, with her carefree and free-spirited ways, had changed his life from their first meeting. She'd appeared at a bar where he was playing on a rainy Thursday night with few customers. She sat right in front, listening to every note with genuine attention that few showed. When he finished the set, she approached. "Your compositions have soul," she said bluntly, "but the third song needed a cello in the background. It'd be perfect." He laughed, surprised by her directness. "And do you play cello by any chance?" "No," she answered with a smile that lit up her whole face. "But I know someone who does. I could introduce you." That's how it began. Simple, uncomplicated. No grand declarations or cinematic moments. Just two people connected by music and sincerity. As he looked at Emily now, he could see so much of Catherine in her. Not just in her features, but in her straightforward way of speaking. Her genuine curiosity. Emily nodded seriously, as if she understood perfectly. "Grandma said you were very sad when Mommy went to heaven." "Very sad," Daniel confirmed, kneeling to meet his daughter's height. "So sad that I thought I couldn't be a good father to you. It was wrong to leave like that, I know, but at the time I thought it was for the best. Your grandmother Beverly could take care of you much better than I could." Richard watched the interaction with a heavy heart. Daniel was being honest with the girl, not making up elaborate excuses or trying to downplay his guilt. And Emily, with her childlike wisdom, seemed to be processing everything with surprising maturity. "Are you still sad?" she asked, taking a step forward. "Sometimes," admitted Daniel. "But today I'm happier than sad because I'm finally seeing you." That was enough to break the ice. With the natural ease of children, Emily suddenly smiled and took Daniel's hand. "Do you want to see my little plants? Uncle Richard gave them to me so I could learn to be a gardener. I've already planted 3 flowers. Daniel let himself be led, casting a grateful glance at Richard over his shoulder. The 2 men, who had once been sworn enemies, now shared a common goal: the happiness of that little girl who unknowingly was rebuilding long-broken bridges. For the next hour, Emily monopolized her father's attention, showing him every corner of the garden, talking non-stop about school, her friends, her grandmother, and yes, about her Uncle Richard, who had magically appeared in her life when she knocked on his door asking for food. "Do you live here now?" Daniel asked at one point, addressing Richard, who was following them at a discreet distance. No, Richard replied quickly. "Emily and Beverly have their own home. Emily just visits me on weekends when Beverly allows it." Daniel nodded, seeming relieved. Perhaps he feared Richard had finally achieved what he'd threatened so many years ago, taking control of his niece's life. When lunch was served, the 3 sat in an initially awkward silence, broken only by Emily's constant chatter, as if she were determined to catch her father up on every minute of her 6 years of life. "Are you staying in Boulder, Daddy?" she suddenly asked between bites. Daniel exchanged an uncertain glance with Richard, as if unsure of the right answer. "I don't know yet, Princess. It depends on a lot of things." "On your work with the band?" she continued, surprising both men with her knowledge. "You know about the band?" Daniel asked, astonished. "Grandma told me. She said you play guitar and sing in lots of different places. I want to learn to play guitar someday, too." "I could teach you," Daniel offered instantly, then hesitated. "That is, if your grandmother allows it, and if I stay around for a while." "Why wouldn't you stay?" Emily asked with the simple logic of a child. "This is where Grandma and I live, and now Uncle Richard is here too." The 2 men exchanged glances again, both aware of the complexity the girl couldn't see. It wasn't that simple. There were untold stories, unresolved hurts, forgiveness neither asked for nor given. "Thus adults complicate things sometimes, Em," Richard replied, using the nickname he'd given his niece. "Your dad needs to figure some things out first, like where he'll live, where he'll work." "He can live with us," Emily exclaimed, as if presenting the perfect solution. "Our apartment is small, but Grandma always says there's room when there's love." The innocence of the suggestion made both men smile at the same time, a rare moment of harmony between them. "It's not that simple, Princess," Daniel explained gently, "but I promise that this time I won't disappear. I'll stay in touch, visit you regularly, be part of your life. That's a promise." Emily seemed satisfied with that, at least for now. As the afternoon came to an end and it was time to take Emily back home, a moment of tension arose. Who would take her? Her uncle as usual, or her father who had just reappeared? "Maybe the 3 of us should go," Richard suggested diplomatically. "Mrs. Beverly probably has a lot to talk about with Daniel, and I'd like to understand why she didn't tell me about his visit." In the car, Emily sat in the back between the 2 men, holding each of their hands, as if physically trying to keep her newly discovered family together. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of the adults. When they arrived at the apartment, Mrs. Beverly was waiting at the door, her face an unreadable mask. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Richard, and finally to Emily, who ran to hug her. "Grandma, Daddy came to see me, and he promised to teach me how to play the guitar, and he said, he won't stay away so long anymore, and look, he and Uncle Richard are getting along. Isn't it wonderful?" Emily's burst of joy softened Mrs. Beverly's expression. "Yes, my dear, very wonderful. Why don't you go to your room for a little while? I got you some new books. They're on your bed. The grown-ups need to talk. For a bit." "But I want to stay with Daddy," the girl protested. "Your father isn't leaving now," Mrs. Beverly assured her. "He's staying for dinner, and you'll have plenty of time to talk later. Now please go to your room for a moment." Reluctant but obedient, Emily left, but not before hugging her father tightly and blowing a kiss to Uncle Richard. When the 3 adults finally found themselves alone in the small living room. The weight of 6 years of untold stories, Resentments and regrets hung over them like a thick cloud. "Why didn't you tell me Daniel was coming?" Richard asked, Mrs. Beverly directly, skipping any preamble. "Because I wanted to see how you'd react," she answered honestly. "Whether you'd try to stop the meeting, whether you'd try to control the situation like you did in the past." "I would never do that," Richard protested. "Not anymore. I needed to be sure. Emily has already grown too attached to you. I couldn't bear to see her hurt if you went back to being the Richard of 6 years ago." Daniel listened to the exchange with interest, noting the many changes in the dynamic he had left behind. "I have questions too," he finally said. "How did Emily end up at Richard's house in the first place? You told me on the phone they met a few months ago, but you didn't explain how." Mrs. Beverly sighed, motioning for them both to sit. It was time for the whole truth to come out, from all sides, so they could move forward. "I got sick," she began. "A bad case of pneumonia. I was weak, feverish, and I couldn't stop Emily from going out alone to look for food. By chance, or maybe fate, she ended up knocking on the door of Richard's mansion. He recognized her immediately. She looks just like Catherine. The rest, as they say, is history." Daniel took a moment to process the information. "So my daughter was going hungry?" he asked, his voice heavy with guilt. "While I was traveling the country with a band playing in bars, she didn't have enough to eat." "It wasn't like that," Mrs. Beverly quickly corrected. "She was never truly in need. It was just a hard time. Me being sick, unable to go to the store, bills piling up. You always sent money when you could, Daniel. You never left us completely helpless. But it wasn't enough, was it?" he pressed, remorse clear in every word. "I should have been here. I should have been taking care of my daughter, not just sending money occasionally like some distant obligation." Richard, who had stayed quiet until then, felt an unexpected urge to defend Daniel. "Mrs. Beverly told me how much you suffered after losing Catherine," he said, surprising both his former mother-in-law and his former brother-in-law. "So I can imagine how devastating it must have been. I nearly lost my mind myself when I found out she was gone, and I didn't even get to see—" His voice faltered, unable to finish the sentence. "I didn't even get to see her body, to say goodbye, to ask for forgiveness, to tell her how much I loved her despite everything." The unspoken words hung in the room like ghosts. "We both made mistakes," Daniel continued, with a maturity that surprised Richard. "I should have been strong enough to stay and raise my daughter despite the pain. You should have respected Catherine's choices while she was alive. And I should have reached out to Richard when Catherine passed, instead of holding on to resentment," added Mrs. Beverly, taking her share of the blame. "But what's the use of talking about what should have been? We're all here now, and Emily deserves to have her family together, not torn apart by past mistakes." A reflective silence settled between them. Finally, the ice of 6 years began to thaw, making way for new possibilities. "What will you do now, Daniel?" Richard asked. "Will you stay in Boulder?" "That's the plan. I left the band yesterday. They went to Chicago, but I stayed. I'm looking for a place to rent nearby so I can see Emily regularly." "And work?" Mrs. Beverly asked, ever practical. "I have some savings to start with, and a friend told me about a music teacher opening at a private school nearby. I have an interview on Monday." Richard seemed thoughtful for a moment. "What a coincidence. I was planning to enroll Emily in a private school. Maybe it's the same one?" Then, realizing he'd spoken without thinking, he quickly added, "With Mrs. Beverly's permission, of course." Mrs. Beverly smiled faintly, leaving both men puzzled. "I was going to tell you today, Richard. I've decided to accept your offer. About the school. Emily deserves the best education possible. And now it seems she might have her father as her music teacher. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it?" The three adults exchanged uncertain but genuine smiles. The road ahead would still be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in 6 years, they all felt they were finally heading in the right direction. In the weeks and months that followed, a new family dynamic began to take shape. Daniel found a small apartment 2 blocks from Mrs. Beverly's house and secured the job as a music teacher at the same school where Emily was enrolled, thanks to Richard's financial support. The girl thrived in her new educational environment, excelling especially in music class, much to her father's pride. Richard, respecting the space of this newly formed family, reduced his visits, but remained present, funding his niece's education and attending important school events. Slowly, he and Daniel developed a relationship of mutual respect, even a cautious friendship, united by their love for little Emily and their memories of Catherine. Nearly a year after their unexpected reunion, Richard received a call from Mrs. Beverly inviting him to dinner at her home. A family dinner, she said, with special emphasis on the word family. It was the first time she had explicitly included him as part of the core family, a gesture that meant more to Richard than he could ever put into words. That evening, gathered in the small living room of the apartment over a simple but lovingly prepared meal by Mrs. Beverly and Emily, the four of them toasted to a new beginning. Daniel played the guitar, teaching Emily new notes as she learned with impressive speed. Mrs. Beverly and Richard chatted amiably about the girls' progress in school, future plans, and memories of Catherine that could now be shared without sharp pain. "You know," Daniel said at one point, tuning his guitar, "Catherine always said her biggest dream was to see our family united, including you, Richard. She suffered from your distance." "I know," replied Richard, his voice heavy with regret. "I was too stubborn to admit I was wrong, too proud to concede. If I could go back—" "We can't go back," Mrs. Beverly gently interrupted. "But we can move forward, and I think Catherine would be happy to see where we are now." Emily, who had been attentively watching the adults' conversation, suddenly spoke up. "I think Mommy is happy in heaven, seeing all of us together now." The simplicity and wisdom of her words moved the three adults deeply. In different ways, each of them had contributed to the journey that brought them here. Mrs. Beverly with her unwavering devotion to her granddaughter, Daniel with his courage to finally face the past, Richard with his ability to change and grow. But it was Emily, a hungry little girl who once knocked on a millionaire's door without knowing he was searching for her, who truly brought them together. Her innocence, her capacity to forgive and love unconditionally, her pure joy in simply having a complete family, all of it served as a powerful reminder of what truly mattered in life. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years had passed since that special dinner. Emily, now 8 years old, had grown into a confident and happy girl, surrounded by the love of her unconventional family. Daniel had established himself as a respected teacher, and his musical talent now found expression not only in his classes but also in original compositions, many of them inspired by Catherine and the daughter they shared. Mrs. Beverly, despite her advancing age, had gained a new energy and purpose, helping organize charity events at Emily's school and using her life experience to guide other families in difficult situations. The pneumonia that had nearly taken her was now just a distant memory, though regular doctor visits, insisted upon by Richard, continued. As for Richard, he too had changed. The cold, calculating businessman, obsessed with control and status, had given way to a more compassionate and self-aware man. His real estate empire continued to grow, but now with a new philosophy. Part of the profits went toward housing projects for low-income families and scholarships for talented young people without means. One sunny Sunday afternoon, the four of them gathered in the mansion's garden. It had become a monthly tradition, a full day spent together, alternating between Mrs. Beverly's home, Daniel's apartment, and Richard's mansion. Emily especially loved the days at the mansion, where she could swim in the pool and tend to the garden she considered her own. "Uncle Richard," she called, approaching him with a serious expression on her freckled face. "Can I ask you something?" "Important." "Of course, Em," he replied, setting aside the magazine he'd been reading. "What is it?" "If I hadn't knocked on your door that day, would you still have been looking for me?" The question, coming out of nowhere, caught Richard off guard. He glanced at Mrs. Beverly and Daniel, who were talking in the distance, then back at his niece, her blue eyes so much like Catherine's. "Yes, Em, I would never have given up on finding you," he answered sincerely. "But I might never have succeeded if you hadn't taken the first step. Emily smiled, satisfied with his answer. You know, sometimes I think it was all because of the rain, she mused, sitting beside her uncle. If it hadn't rained that day, Grandma wouldn't have gotten so sick. If she hadn't gotten so sick, I wouldn't have had to go out looking for food. If I hadn't left, I never would have found you. Richard reflected on his niece's words. There was so much wisdom in them. You're right, Em. It's funny how life works, isn't it? Sometimes the hardest moments end up taking us exactly where we're meant to be. Like when Mommy went to heaven, she continued with the same seriousness. It was so sad, but if she hadn't gone, maybe you and Daddy would never have made up. Maybe you'd still be fighting and I'd be stuck in the middle having to choose. Richard felt a lump in his throat. How could someone so young see so clearly what had taken the adults years to understand? You're very wise for your age, you know that, he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, just like your mother. Emily smiled, proud of the comparison. Daddy said we're going to play together at the school concert next month. He wrote a special song just for us. You and Grandma will be there, won't you? We wouldn't miss it for the world, Richard promised. On the other side of the garden, Mrs. Beverly watched the interaction between uncle and niece with a serene smile. Beside her, Daniel followed her gaze. Who would have thought we'd end up here, he remarked, shaking his head in wonder. After everything that happened, we shouldn't be so surprised, Mrs. Beverly replied. Catherine always believed you two would work things out one day. She used to say you and Richard were more alike than either of you would ever admit. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. She told me that during our last big fight, you know. 2 weeks before she... He swallowed hard, still unable to say the word even after all these years. Before the delivery, I was furious because Richard had called again, trying to convince her to get prenatal care at some expensive private clinic, as if the doctor at the public clinic wasn't good enough for us. Mrs. Beverly nodded, remembering those tense days. Well, Catherine was tired of being caught between you two. I told her we didn't need her rich brother's charity, Daniel continued, shame heavy in his voice. Said I'd figure it out, that I'd book more gigs, that we didn't need anyone. And you know what she said to me? Mrs. Beverly shook her head, though she suspected the answer. She said, "You're both so stubborn, so proud. Richard thinks money solves everything, and you think love is enough. Neither of you sees that we need both." Daniel closed his eyes, reliving the moment. Then she took my hands, pressed them, to her belly where Emily was, and said, "This child is going to need all of us, her father, her grandmother, and yes, her uncle too. Don't deny her a whole family because of pride." A tear rolled down Daniel's face, and he made no effort to hide it. The next day, I went out to buy a peace offering for Richard. Thought if I made the first move, maybe we could settle things before the baby came. I bought a picture frame, put in a photo of me and Catherine, and wrote a note saying he'd be welcome in our daughter's life. Never got to give it to him. When I got home, Catherine was in premature labor. Mrs. Beverly rested a hand on Daniel's arm, offering silent comfort. She'd never heard this part of the story. Catherine had been rushed to the hospital, the delivery complicated, the hemorrhage the doctors couldn't stop. After Catherine was gone, I couldn't bring myself to care about anything, he went on, voice low. Not even that perfect little bundle the nurses put in my arms. All I could see was everything I'd lost. I spent months in limbo doing the bare minimum, leaving most of Emily's care to you until one day you left and never came back, Mrs. Beverly finished, her voice free of accusation, simply stating a fact. Guilt consumed me, Beverly. Guilt for not being able to love my daughter the way she deserved. Guilt for not listening to Catherine when she said we needed help. Guilt for being such an inadequate father. And ironically, I ended up doing exactly what Richard always predicted. I abandoned my responsibility. He looked at Emily, who was now showing her uncle some gardening techniques, both kneeling in the flower bed. Can you believe I carried that picture frame and Richard's card with me all these years? It's in my hotel suitcase right now, a constant reminder of how I let Catherine down. Daniel chuckled softly. She was right, as always, both stubborn, protective, loyal to those we love. The difference was Richard showed love by trying to control, while I showed it by giving space. In the end, we both got it wrong. Mrs. Beverly nodded thoughtfully. And you both learned, thanks to Emily. The sound of the girl's crystalline laughter echoed through the garden as she chatted excitedly to her uncle, gesturing animatedly. It was a sound that healed old wounds, filled empty spaces, and built bridges where there had once been chasms. That evening, after Mrs. Beverly and Emily had gone home, and Daniel to his apartment, Richard was alone in the mansion, which no longer felt as empty as before. The family's regular visits had filled the rooms with happy memories, laughter, conversations and music. Even when they left, something of their presence lingered like a subtle fragrance in the air. He went to his study and opened the carved wooden box that now held a place of honor on his desk, no longer hidden in a drawer. The photographs of Catherine, which once brought only pain, now evoked a nostalgic smile. Beside them, new photos had been added. Emily on her first day at her new school, Daniel and Emily playing guitar together, Mrs. Beverly teaching her granddaughter how to bake cookies, the four of them gathered in front of the Christmas tree the year before. Nearby, in his small apartment, Daniel was also awake. With his guitar in his lap, he worked on the melody he and his daughter would perform the following month. It was a song about loss and reunion, about how love can find unexpected ways back to us when we least expect it. In certain passages, he wove in the melody of the lullaby Catherine used to sing, the same one Emily had hummed to Richard the day they met. And in the modest house a few blocks away, Mrs. Beverly gently stroked Emily's hair as the girl slept soundly after a day full of fun. In the little girl's room, different worlds came together. The guitar from Daniel, the books from Richard, the patchwork quilt made by Mrs. Beverly's hands, and in a special place on the dresser, a photograph of Catherine, smiling as if she knew that despite all the pain and obstacles, her family would find their way back to one another. Their story, like so many real ones, didn't have a dramatic ending or a magical solution to every problem. Life went on with its daily challenges, bills to pay, decisions to make, occasional disagreements to resolve. But there was one fundamental difference. Now they faced it all together, as a family. And it all began on that rainy afternoon, when a hungry little girl, desperate for a piece of bread, knocked on a millionaire's door, not knowing he had been searching for her for years. Life, in its mysterious wisdom, sometimes lets us go, hungry so we can find not just the bread that feeds the body, but the love that nourishes the soul. The doors we knock on in moments of despair may be exactly the ones we should have found long ago. For Emily, it was just a moment of childlike courage, an impulse born of necessity. For Richard, it was the answer to 6 years of searching. For Daniel, it was the path back to the responsibility he had abandoned. For Mrs. Beverly, it was the acceptance that forgiveness, even when late, can open new horizons. For all of them, it was the beginning of a journey of healing and reconciliation that none of them could have imagined possible, a journey that would continue through the years to come, with its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and obstacles, but always with the certainty that they would never have to walk it alone again. On Emily's 10th birthday, 4 years after that first meeting in the mansion, a special celebration was held in the garden of Mrs. Beverly's home, now a comfortable house in the same neighborhood, bought with Richard's help, but in Mrs. Beverly's name, respecting her wish for independence. The party brought together not just the immediate family, but also school friends, neighbors, and even some of Richard's employees, who had grown fond of the girl over the years. Margaret, in particular, had taken on the role of a sort of surrogate grandmother, teaching Emily to cook traditional recipes on the weekends she spent at the mansion. Daniel, who now ran a small but respected music school in Boulder, had prepared a special surprise. When all the guests had arrived, he stepped onto the makeshift stage in the garden, accompanied by some of his most talented students. "Today," he announced into the microphone, "I want to present a special composition, written for 3 extraordinary women, one who left us too soon but remains in our hearts, one who showed strength and unconditional love even in the hardest moments, and one who at 10 years old has already taught us more about forgiveness and love than we might learn in a lifetime." Emily, seated at the main table between Mrs. Beverly and Richard, blushed with excitement as her father began to play. The melody started softly, almost melancholy, subtly weaving in fragments of the lullaby Catherine used to sing. Gradually, it transformed into something brighter, more hopeful, symbolizing the journey of pain and healing they had all walked. When the music ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Richard, usually so composed in public, made no effort to hide the tears streaming down his face. Mrs. Beverly held Emily's hand tightly, as if anchoring herself in the present, refusing to be swept away by the waves of past emotion. Emily stood and ran to hug her father, quickly followed by Mrs. Beverly, and after a brief hesitation, Richard as well. The four of them stood embraced on the little stage, a picture of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Later that evening, when the guests had left and Emily had finally fallen asleep, exhausted but happy, the three adults gathered on the small porch, sharing a bottle of wine and memories. "Do you know what she wished for when she blew out the candles?" Mrs. Beverly asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Richard and Daniel looked at her, curious. "She told me before bed," Mrs. Beverly continued with a serene smile. "She wished that we stay like this, all together, a real family." "I think that's a wish we can fulfill," Daniel replied, raising his glass in a silent toast. "For Catherine," Richard said, lifting his glass as well, "who somehow got what she wanted in the end." "For Catherine," Mrs. Beverly and Daniel echoed in unison. In the next room, Emily smiled in her sleep, lulled by the murmur of beloved voices mingling with the night breeze. In her dream, a woman with brown hair and blue eyes sang to her the lullaby that had spanned generations, connecting past and present in a melody of love that transcended time and circumstance. The family, they discovered, isn't just the one we're born into, but also the one we build throughout life through daily choices of love, forgiveness, and understanding. And sometimes it takes a small hand knocking on a door to show us the way back home. End of story. If this tale of reunions and forgiveness touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments, do you believe destiny brought this family together, or was it just coincidence? Your opinion means so much to us.